come in the arena, make the ground shake, make the ground scream. Me feeling a gauntlet enemy, bring the fire when I fight to the melody. Blood fire, you beginner, keep on the game, me a winner. Your man them know me a leader, when I come in the arena. When I come in the arena. Let's go.
Feel free to help yourself to food or anything. If there's anything you guys need, just ask.
Thank you. Can you run out and get us a beer?
Oh, that's so weird.
Maybe after. Maybe after.
I still have some stuff to do upstairs, but probably hang around for like 5-10 minutes, then we'll go up.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because we were connected to SGInnovate.
Oh yeah, I was quite surprised that it was a club that's opening, as in that's hosting the event, because usually it's like a startup or like a company. It's okay, I didn't really know. Serious thing, I think as kids we don't understand. Second week.
Wow, no wonder for a moment you're like, sorry, I didn't get your name.
Jodie.
Jodie, oh, so you and Zing were once exchanging, replying the emails and so on.
I was not aware, as I was not in email thread, so I was just like, are you like in third year or so?
No, I'm in my final year, final semester, almost done.
Okay. Yeah, actually, 4 years also, because NBS is 3 years.
That's so good, so lucky.
Yeah, okay, should we just start? There's like no one.
6:30, right? Now, right? I need to take some photos.
Oh, you want to take first?
No, take photo of you.
Oh, now ah? Oh, okay.
You just...
You want me to stand here? It's so weird. You want me to just speak? Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today on a Friday. My name is Jodie and I'm from SGInnovate. And for those of you who are unaware of SGInnovate, we're actually, we help deep tech ecosystem startups, especially in Singapore, in the areas of autonomous vehicles, medtech, AI, and blockchain. So today we're very fortunate to be able to present to you with partnering with SMU Blockchain Club on the event topic of what's next for blockchain. And without further ado, I'll pass the time over to Evan here from the SMU Blockchain Club to open the event.
Thank you. Hi everyone. Thanks for taking out this Friday night, Friday evening to join us here to learn more about blockchain. We're really fortunate tonight here with us, our panelists. And I mean, the topic we're going to be discussing about is really pretty exciting. So we really hope that there'll be takeaways from this session. If you don't know, there's food behind, so help yourself to it. I'm Evan, the president of SMU Blockchain Club, alongside my team all behind as well. We founded this club just last summer, over last summer. So right now we're just not even a year old, just maybe around 6 to 7 months old. So just a brief introduction of what we do before we actually invite our panelists up to start. This should be the flow of events by today, introducing the club. So we are running a bit late because we wanted to get everyone cozy and seated down first. After, we'll be having a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session, and we'll close the session by around 8 o'clock. So what is SMU Blockchain Club and what do we do? So if you don't know, we are from SMU, Singapore Management University. We were one of the first few we were the first university actually to start a blockchain club. Really just set out to educate students and provide an avenue for students to learn more about blockchain. I mean, because amidst all the media hype and about cryptocurrencies and everything, we really wanted to make it a point to empower students or provide them with an avenue to find out more about what blockchain actually is and what it actually do. So here are some events that we have conducted over the last semester. Block Night, a networking event where we invited professionals down to speak with students. We have panel sessions when we first launched last year, where we partnered with X Square, CoinHarco, Zilliqa, etc. And we also conduct our own workshop sessions, teaching students mainly in two areas. Firstly, enterprise blockchain, the applications of blockchain in organizations these days, like how are they being adopted. And the other side that we actually teach students on briefly is an introduction to the technicalities of blockchain development, etc. So we are also quite fortunate to be one of the few schools worldwide to take part in this, to be invited to take part in Consensus Academy MBA Blockchain Venture Competition. So it's actually pretty exciting because we have quite a few teams who are through and currently still going through the process of this competition. This semester, we want to make it a bit different for our students. So what we had was we partnered with a few companies, big companies like Essential Technology, EY, Lunex Ventures, and SGX, where they came down to school to share with students about how blockchain is being adopted or experimented with within their organizations. So over time, we have actually seen the club really grow in members, and we also can see we have been also seeing new faces over time. And right now, in the midst of all of you, there are also students here actually wanting to learn more. So without further ado, wait, just before I start this, so today's session panel would be, it's about what's next for blockchain, if you don't know. So later we'll just go on with this, but something that I'd like to highlight to everyone is take out your phones, log into slido.com, and just with the hashtag just log in with SMUB. You don't have to create an account or anything, but this will be what we'll be using later to facilitate discussions and questions. If you want to ask questions verbally as well, just raise your hands in the middle. Throughout the panel, we'll pass you a mic to ask your questions as well. But if you're not comfortable asking physically, just log on. You can stay anonymous, and you can upvote and downvote. You can actually upvote questions being asked as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists, Professor Paul Griffin, Jimmy Ong, Tom Menner, and Tusha, to come up and really just kick off this session. Hope you have a good night.
Thank you, Evan. I'll just let the panelists sit down and get comfortable. Oh, your microphone's working.
Mine's not.
Yours not? Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Well, thanks for coming this evening. Yes, we've got some good panelists, very diverse group. I'll just briefly introduce them, and then I'll let them introduce themselves and what they're interested in, and then we get started. Actually, first of all, myself, yeah, I'm from SMU as well. I'm Associate Professor in the School of Information Systems. And my main area is blockchain. I teach blockchain to undergraduates and postgraduates. We have a Master of IT in Business master's course, so that's my plug for the night. So if anyone wants to do a master's in financial technology and analytics, let me know. And I do research in decentralized exchanges and interoperability, and a little bit of quantum consensus I'm throwing in as well. So we have Mr. Jimmy Ong from Ernst Young, the technology partner APAC blockchain leader. Tom Menner from R3, who's director and solution architecture for Asia Pacific. And Mr. Tushar Agarwal, who's principal at Linux. So I'll let you introduce yourselves, please.
Sure. My name is Tushar, and I work at Lunex Ventures, which is the crypto slash blockchain arm of a traditional venture capital fund called Golden Gate Ventures. So Golden Gate Ventures is a traditional VC fund that has been funding seed and Series A startups since about 2012. Some of our biggest investments in Singapore have been Redmart, Carousel, 99.co, and a few others in Indonesia and surrounding countries. One of our equity investments was a company called Omise, Not sure if there's any Omisego holders here. The fund could not participate in the token sale, and hence a dedicated fund was born whose mandate allowed it to hold both equity as well as tokens. In general, we are, we have a very, very flexible and broad mandate. We take equity stakes in early stage blockchain startups. We can do mixtures of equity and tokens. We can invest in tokens, both in the primary as well as secondary markets. So we can invest in ICOs, we can invest in STOs, but we can also invest in things that are already trading on the secondary markets. So we have Bitcoin in our portfolio, we have Ether, we have a bunch of other tokens and cryptocurrencies that we fundamentally believe in. We're not a hedge fund, so there's a lot of crypto hedge funds. We're a venture fund, so we take, relatively speaking, longer term positions, both on the token side as well as equity side.
Yeah, Tom, do you like to say?
Good evening. My name is Tom Menner. I am the Director for Solution Architecture for a company called R3. R3 is, amongst the enterprise blockchains, we're one of the big three. Arguably, there's Hyperledger Fabric, there's Ethereum and its offshoots, including Quorum, and there's what's called Corda, which is our platform. R3 started life as a research company based on Wall Street, where we were tasked with looking at cryptocurrencies and blockchains to see whether it was applicable for the banking and financial world. And in the end, after running a number of pilots, doing a bunch of research on it, decided that actually for the stringent requirements of KYC and AML type regulated businesses, in fact, it probably made sense to actually create a blockchain from scratch, or at least a distributed ledger technology from scratch, which became Corda. I'm not going to go into technical details on that unless it, say, comes up in the panel or grab me afterward. Happy to talk about it. But we found that once you build a blockchain for those kinds of stringent requirements, a lot of other industries wind up taking interest in that. So we've actually expanded well outside of our banking and financial pedigree and involved with a lot of use cases across a number of different industries. So that's basically what I do around Asia Pacific. Basically meet with clients or governments, as the case might be, to discuss what the solution might be, what the requirements are, and whether a DLT-based solution would be suitable for what they're trying to do. Just to throw a little bit more fuel on the fire, I worked at IBM for a good 22 years. I worked on Hyperledger Fabric before I came over to R3, before I saw the light and came over to R3. And so I'm actually familiar with a number of different blockchain technologies, and I've worked on a couple of different ones.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Jimmy Ong. I'm from Ernst & Young Advisory, or EY for short. I'm a technology partner in EY, based out of Singapore, and I wear another hat in EY as well as the APAC blockchain leader. So a lot of what we do in blockchain is around enterprise blockchain. By that, we actually connect enterprise ecosystem or large groups of companies who network and work together through the blockchain. So some of the solutions that we deploy for the client are on different platforms. So we have worked on Coda, we have worked on Hyperledger, and a lot of work is on Ethereum as well. So the top three that Tom just mentioned. And maybe some of the use cases that I can talk about a little bit later is on traceability, is on distributed contract management, is on supply chain. So I'm keen to share more later as well on real production grade, use cases that we see now in the market as well, other than those in the financial services sector, other than those that are cryptocurrency related.
Okay, thank you very much. You know who the panel are. So yeah, this session really is about what's next for blockchain. We've seen some blockchains starting up now. I mean, blockchain's been around for 10 years if you include starting off with Bitcoin. I think it's now starting to take off in the enterprise world. I mean, a couple of years ago I was seeing POCs, last year was pilots, and now it's saying we're starting to see real applications coming out. Some people may say it's still a bit slow, so the first question is, how can business leaders drive the advances in blockchain technology? So Jimmy, you're seeing a lot of companies in the consultancy, so what can business leaders do to advance blockchain further and faster?
Yes, good question. I think that first of all, blockchain is slow to start, not because of lack of interest, that's for sure. It's slow to start because, first and foremost, it's a foundational technology. It's a database and a distributed database. And secondly, it's a pretty complex one, right? To implement is a pretty complex one. So I guess because of the hype around cryptocurrencies, the interest is strong, but trying to rip out the plumbing of enterprise systems is not so easy. So I think that over the past 2 or 3 years, Paul, you have mentioned correctly, right? We see there's an uptick in not just interest from enterprises and business leaders, but also people trying it out more, testing it out more. And I think that's the first start, because when you try the technology and you use it more often, you gain understanding of how the technology works. And your partners and ecosystem also gain that understanding, and that's crucial, because we believe that blockchain is not a technology for a single enterprise. Let me just repeat that again. It's not a technology used for a single enterprise, but because within a single enterprise, you have your ERP system. Not your electronic road pricing, but your enterprise resource planning system, right? So the SAPs, the Oracles, and Microsofts out there have very robust ERP system that has evolved over the past 10, 20 years. And the practices and processes within it are so strong that I really don't see business leaders or CIOs ripping out this plumbing, and putting it on a blockchain. But what is very useful for blockchain is to be able to connect different enterprises and different systems. So if you have a large ecosystem of companies, a large network of companies, and you want to be able to integrate them together, I think blockchain makes a fantastic platform. So that testing and trialing and educating themselves and their ecosystem of partners is very important. Secondly, I think that it's important also to look beyond the technology of blockchain. Because at the end of the day, whatever technology you apply, right, be it blockchain or AI or IoT, it is used to solve real-world business problem, right? And if the problem is not solved, or if the ROI doesn't make sense, then I think it will remain a technology that is not applicable. So I feel that it's important for business leaders to look beyond the technology. I think it's important to grasp a good extent of what this technology does, right? But applying it to the right business context, solving real-world problems, I think that will help a lot in the uptake.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, Tom, do you see business leaders driving blockchain technology as well?
Sure. So I think Jimmy makes a really great point about the fact that a blockchain, in terms of use cases, really is best served when you're talking about multiple counterparties, trying to achieve some transactionality between themselves. People look at blockchain as perhaps trying to be applicable to a lot of different scenarios. And you also have, to be frank, it's conflated also with cryptocurrency. So there may very well be people in this room, for example, who say, look, Bitcoin equals blockchain, blockchain equals Bitcoin, and that's that.
I hope not.
Please raise your hand so we can identify you.
I'll see you later.
But that being said, especially for somebody like myself who comes from a middleware background from IBM, it became pretty apparent that blockchain really was just a specialized database with some transactional features and some unique characteristics like append-only operations and the ability to do the hashing to connect the data such that it becomes presumably immutable, becomes tamper-proof. So you can separate out that layer, that data layer, from the rest of the cryptocurrency. And this is what people have focused on. This is what's interesting to the enterprise. Now, we could still maybe use tokenization or digital assets on top of that, but I could also use, for example, our classic use case is something like supply chain management or trade finance. But I think going back to, again, one of the points Jimmy made, it's really going to be most useful, again, if you are working with other partners, with trading partners, because if it's all within house, I'll just use a centralized database. And in fact, when I speak with clients, I'll often make that case that, okay, prove to me that this is better done by a blockchain rather than a centralized database. And then if we can get past that hump, then we can start to talk about the blockchain solution. So one of the issues with doing that, though, is typically you're talking about multiple counterparties that are completely different legal and financial entities. So to get them all working together on a supply chain solution, or get them all working together on a trade finance solution, something like that, actually the governance of that proves to be much, much more difficult than the technology that's involved with actually building that blockchain. So there's, when it comes to actually building business networks, for example, we find that a lot of the issue is how do you set up a foundation or a consortium to do this? How do you get natural rivals to talk to one another? Get them in the same room to agree on protocol standards and data standards and things like that. But beyond that, then the technology actually becomes quite useful. And again, as Jimmy mentioned, one of the things that you'll need to point to is the return on investment. So you have to measure, okay, if I do this blockchain POC, what cost savings did I achieve, or what new revenue channels did I open? Because otherwise, you know, again, stick with your traditional technologies.
Yeah. Thanks. So, I mean, Tushar, from a VC perspective, do you see business leaders driving blockchain, or is it all just the kind of new guys coming in?
So I think in general, and I think this is the narrative we've seen on this panel as well, and the narrative by enterprises in general, where you want to kind of operate in a, you know, what is called a permissioned setting, where there's enterprises interacting with each other, but you're not really sort of, you know, what is called truly open source or permissionless, where anyone can join the network. So to draw a parallel, like for example, and this is not directly kind of answering the question, but I want to kind of drive another point through what I'm just describing. So like if you go back to the 90s, we had the intranet as well as the internet. And they were almost equally big, like equal in size in terms of, you know, there were bigger corporations that used the intranet because they wanted their employees and their perhaps some partners, some vendors to kind of interact and have access to particular data, be hooked up to the network, but that was just within the organization. But there was also this thing called the internet where anyone could join the network. And in today's context, so there's two kinds of sort of blockchains, as we call them. So there's blockchains like Bitcoin, which is, you know, totally permissionless. Anyone can join the Bitcoin network. And on the other hand, you have private blockchains. What we believe at Lunex is that the public blockchains, like the internet, because it's permissionless, because anyone can join the network, is on a long enough time horizon going to be one or two or even more orders of magnitude bigger than the private blockchains. I think in the foreseeable future, we'll still have private blockchains, but I think over a period of time, I think some of the enterprises are going to become more and more comfortable with sharing their data publicly.
Can I just add something as well? I think I really believe in that point of view, but maybe I will cover that in the interoperability question as well. But just one thing to add as well that's very interesting is, just now Tom talked about consortium. So if you look at how the large blockchain networks are being applied, so we mentioned that people have started to do trials, they have started to do POCs, going to pilots and even production system now. In fact, there's two ways, in fact, that you see large networks being deployed. The first way is via the consortium, like Tom mentioned, right? Because there's a lead company, there's a company that's big enough to hold the flag and carry the flag and say, hey, come, follow me, right? And when Walmart says, follow me, right, all their suppliers, it's not an ask, right? It's saying, you know, please join, otherwise you can't do business with me. So as a result, large consortium does work in getting some foothold into early stage developments of blockchain. And those are typically private blockchains, right? Maybe we will cover a little bit later between private and public. But the second area that we see happening is also a regulator taking the lead, right? In fact, I was just talking to a gentleman before this session as well that a lot of blockchain startups have great ideas, but it's not taking off because there is no, this is the irony, right? The regulators are not involved, right? Because Bitcoin, when it's first started, the legacy behind it is I don't want it to be regulated. I don't want it to be having some form of intermediary, right? But the irony of it is that for this technology, I feel to continue to take off, some aspects of regulation will help. Right, because otherwise, whenever it involves the final leg, which is talking about money transaction, security tokens, or even things like a fiat currency tokens, it will be very hard to get, a takeoff, right? Because at the end of the day, you and I live in a world that is still working on Singapore dollars, is still working on US dollars, right? So you do need some form of regulatory aspects of things, and sometimes a regulator taking the lead, either in terms of a certain ecosystem or taking the lead in terms of providing guidance on the interoperability issues, it will help a lot, I feel.
Absolutely. I think, sorry to jump in, but so I think, so when we talk about big enterprises, right, so the kind of startups that we back are actually trying to disrupt the very enterprises that we're talking about here. And so from our perspective, obviously we work within the regulator's mandate, but I think on the flip side, you're also trying to push the boundaries a little bit, right? So we wouldn't have Uber if Uber was following all the regulations globally. They pushed the envelope a little bit and changed the world. So those are the kind of startups that you want to back where you're still operating within certain frameworks, but you're still trying to push the boundaries a little bit to make the world more efficient, more transparent, more open.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I also want to take a kind of a reality check. We've talked about the pilots, POCs, and now production systems, but exactly how big are these production systems? What are the volumes? What are the cost savings? I've seen kind of cost estimations, but what's really happening out there? I know, Tom, how big a systems have you really been implementing or implemented right now?
Right. Corda has been around probably for about a year and a half, 2 years, since version 1.0 open source. And we're up to about 15 production systems worldwide with a pipeline of maybe 100 others about to come online sometime in the next 18 months or so. And the volumes that we see are still relatively nascent, not surprisingly, as these folks build up their trading networks or as they build up their supply chain network. Or quite often it's also providing some software as a service kind of model where they build something that happens to run on top of a blockchain, but it's providing some other business service like syndicated lending, for example, is one of the systems that we have in production. That being said, for example, the DTCC out of New York City, which is Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, where all security settlements in the United States are done through that one organization. Just kind of, I guess, for the hell of it, they decided to do a stress performance test of all the major blockchains, basically ourselves, Fabric, Quorum, and digital assets. And in the end, they found that, first of all, only 2 of the blockchains were able to perform, ourselves and digital assets, but they were able to get up to average 6,000 transactions per second, high watermark of 20,000 transactions per second. Now, granted, that was with some workload sharding. That's also with shaping the workload to some extent. But it just shows that from a transactional perspective, the technology is baking. I wouldn't say that it's completely baked, not by a long stretch, but the ability to actually implement this in an enterprise setting and then throw a lot of workload at it has actually already been demonstrated. And I know that, for example, IBM is certainly working to improve the stability and the performance of Fabric as well. And obviously the Ethereum folks are trying to improve the performance of the public blockchain. So that being said, outside of Bitcoin and Ethereum, which in fact are doing some interesting workloads, at least worldwide, but if you actually look at, if you dig into the workload on Ethereum, you find out that actually a lot of it is gaming, more so than actually real world work. So on the one hand, it's great that it can support CryptoKitties, but on the other hand, if I'm running a business, I don't necessarily care about that. So if anything, I'm more concerned that it might blow up again with the next release of CryptoKitties. So I think also if IBM were here, they'd probably be saying, well, we have a few production blockchain systems. Again, most of them are pilots or POCs, kind of similar to what we're doing. But gradually, you are starting to see enterprise systems come online. And I'm sure that Jimmy at EY, I'm sure these guys have seen a bunch of, and actually brought some of these online themselves.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Tom. I think Corda is certainly scaling up very nicely. And maybe I will share one of the largest use cases that we have seen and we have deployed with a client. So one of these use cases is on distributed contract management or royalties management, and it's with Microsoft Xbox machines. How many of you use Xbox machine or have children that do it? Okay, there's a few behind as well. So Xbox machines, in fact, are deployed by Microsoft, but the games behind those machines are dependent on maybe about 6,000 different publishers. And those 6,000 publishers, in turn, they don't build the games themselves. What they do is they also hire subcontractors, or they hire developers that develop the games for them, which, you know, there are tens of thousands of developers for them. And behind those developers, again, you know, they don't have a full team. Sometimes they subcontract voiceover artists. Sometimes they contract people that draw or people that code the games as well. So you can see the many layers behind the Xbox machine, behind Microsoft. You have publishers, 6,000 of them, and you have behind them the developers, and behind them artists and so on. And the way that royalties are distributed down the chain is an extremely complex way of doing it. So what Microsoft decided to do is to deploy their royalties management system on a blockchain. So all these contracts, in fact, with the publishers are very similar. They are not exactly the same across regions for different publishers. If you're a large publisher, you might have better terms. If you're a smaller publisher, not so favorable terms. But, you know, it's similar contract, and these contracts can be deployed on a smart contract where they compute based on usage, based on downloads, based on which regions, how much royalties is due to the publisher. So in terms of ROI, we spoke about it a little bit earlier. So ROI is quite real, right? Because today, for Microsoft to be able to compute and pay the publisher, it takes 45 days. And not because you know, they try to delay and slow down the payment, just because of the volume of data and the amount of computation required behind it. There's a big team, in fact, doing the computation and sending it out to the publisher. And for the publisher to get down to the last guy, in fact, it's because so many levels down, it takes up to even 90 days. So now the blockchain system is at the early stages with the top 7 publishers of Microsoft. From 45 days is cut down to 4 minutes. Right, so that's a tremendous savings. In fact, if you think about it, from a Microsoft point of view, is beyond just the ROI of efficient payment of royalties to their publishers. It also reduces a lot of lawsuit. They anticipate that, you know, going ahead, because of the transparency on how it's computed, because of the transparency of the data required to use it, it will lead to a lot less litigation. And Microsoft has not lost any of these suits. It's largely because people are just don't have full visibility of all the data, and this blockchain will actually solve that problem as well.
So 7 out of 6,000, what's the roadmap to bring the other 5,993?
That's actually a good question, right? I'm not sure if every publisher will eventually get on the blockchain, but certainly the largest of them, you know, the top 7 of them are already taking a large volume of what's the data, and the plan is for them to progressively roll out, and I think Tom covered a little bit about the performance issue as well, right? We are looking at about maybe 100,000 transactions a day, which is pretty decent. I think that problem over time is a matter of time that technology will continue to solve it, either through sharding or different reasons as well.
Okay, thanks. Tushar, what's your best blockchain real-life situation at the moment that you see?
CryptoKitties. No, I think more seriously speaking. So I mean, I think this was brought up in the panel before as well. So gaming is one of the early use cases. And again, you know, I try to study history to be able, as an investor, what are you trying to do? You're trying to predict the future, especially as a venture investor. How do you predict the future? The best way to predict the future is to read history, because I mean, whatever, you know, new innovation happens, and we've seen this gotten repeated again and again. So in 2017, there was an ICO bubble. There was a lot of hype. A lot of companies were super opportunistic in terms of raising capital. And the pace of innovation kind of got decoupled from the actual prices of some of the tokens and some of the cryptocurrencies. But I think, you know, now what's happened is, I think, you know, the market is corrected quite a bit. We're down about 80, 85, 90%. From all-time highs, depending on what cryptocurrency you're looking at. But I think, you know, in the background, there's a lot of developers, a lot of other very, very talented people who are still working in the industry and trying to build it. And I think we'll reach a point, you know, over the next couple of years where if the prices remain constant, that, you know, the innovation would have actually gotten decoupled from the prices. But again, it's all, in terms of valuations, it's all relative. Again, but going back to history, I mean, the first cases, I mean, who was using the internet in the early 90s? It was you. There was no browser, right? So you actually had to know how to write. You know, like you had to use command line interface. There was no Google Chrome. There was no Internet Explorer. There was no Safari. The first browser came in 1993, 1994, and before that, it was basically people who were. It was the nerds. It was the weirdos. It was the gamers, it was, and even early on, right? It was, and then, you know, I mean, in 1993, 1994, once you know there was a browser, it became a little bit easier to interact with the internet. You know, more people started coming in. Still, I mean, I think some of the earliest use cases were things like gambling and gaming, which is the case in crypto today. I think beyond that, I think beyond gaming, so CryptoKitties, I mean, if you look at the top 10 applications, top 10 applications that are being built on different blockchains, a lot of them are gaming and gambling applications. But I think beyond that, there's a huge narrative around decentralized finance, which is, so decentralized finance is basically, I mean, if you have $100 in your pocket, what are the things that you would want to do with it? You'd probably want to put it in the bank so that you can earn interest with it. You'd probably want to invest it somewhere, or speculate with the $100. You want to spend the $100. You want to maybe buy insurance with the $100. Those are the different things that you want to do. And there are different applications that are being built within the crypto ecosystem. So there's this entire layer of crypto banking solutions that are being built, where you can have currencies which are stable, which do not fluctuate wildly, and which are not very volatile, where you can actually lend out your cryptocurrencies and earn interest on it. You can buy insurance using these cryptocurrencies. You can buy derivative products using these cryptocurrencies. So it's basically all the things that you do with money today. There's a layer being built in the crypto ecosystem or the blockchain ecosystem, where you can do the same things. But again, you don't have to put the money in the bank, basically. And there's no one dictating, you know, what are the kinds of products that you are allowed to buy or you're not allowed to buy. And that's the entire narrative around, quote unquote, being decentralized. The entire ethos of being decentralized is that there's no middlemen who actually dictate the things that you can or cannot do. So I think decentralized finance is something where we're seeing a little bit of traction. Right now, the user interface and the user experience is such that it's primarily only people within the crypto ecosystem who have the time, energy, and who have the interest to read guides to be able to use these different applications. So it's not extremely user-friendly. But I think we'll reach a point where it'll be as simple or as intuitive as just downloading an Uber application, or downloading Grab, or downloading something like a Slack, and then you just create an account and you start using it. It's highly, highly intuitive, and we'll get to those that point soon enough where you can interact with these Web 3.0 applications, but with a very intuitive and very user-friendly interface.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we've got the future. We've got the kind of reality where blockchain is moving forward. But we've got a good question here on what's the biggest hurdle which is holding back the development. I mean, we've heard a bit about technology, maturity, regulations. What's the number one things that's slowing down blockchain development? Right?
Should I?
Yeah.
Okay. So I mentioned a little bit of this when we first started off. I feel that blockchain is a foundational technology, and as such, the slowness of implementation is not because of the technology itself. I feel a lot of people think that the scalability and the performance is one of the reasons. I think that in the near future, that will be resolved. So the difficulty, in fact, is getting the right people to agree that we want to use blockchain, right? That's a tough one, right? Because it's foundational, you need to have a lot of alignment between people who wants to do this. So trade finance is one example. For trade finance, in fact, you need banks to agree, you need buyers to agree, you need sellers to agree, and you need these people to be able to commonly come on board the same platform. And that takes time. That takes an understanding of not just the technology that's going to be involved, how it connects or interoperate with their current ERP system. It also takes a lot of business understanding as well. How does the finance flow works? How do we extend beyond trade finance to utilize the full function of blockchain? So my view is that the slowness in taking off this technology is because it's a foundational technology, and the difficulty in rallying or pulling together ecosystems of people, of business people that wants to agree to go together on this journey.
Thanks.
So I think there's a couple different factors that are kind of gating the adoption of blockchain. One of them, I think, is the, again, the kind of conflation of cryptocurrencies and the underlying blockchain technology itself. Mostly because I think, for better or worse, the whole ICO market really scared people off of getting involved with this stuff. And for example, we were basically forbidden from talking about tokens or coins whatsoever, even though there might be a very legitimate business case for doing so, for actually implementing a digitized asset as a token or as a cryptocurrency. But for example, if you talk to central banks, they absolutely did not want to hear about this. We were even starting to be told, don't call yourselves a blockchain, call yourselves a distributed ledger, which is full circle, because we originally got beaten up for calling ourselves a blockchain when we are, in fact, technically a distributed ledger. So it's really kind of muddied the waters of, okay, when you talk about a blockchain, are you really talking about a cryptocurrency? Are you talking about tokenization? Are you talking about a data tier that can be completely independent of the coin or token? So it really depends who you're talking to in that regard. And then also the public versus private. So to some extent, people are waiting to see how this all shakes out, what technology is going to win, things like that. But I think with the collapse of the ICO market, that's kind of cleared the deck somewhat, such that my company, for example, now does talk about tokens and coins purely within a business context. So it wouldn't be something that we would perhaps publicly list for our corporate clients or what have you. But even the central banks would be saying, okay, for the purposes of cash liquidity and transparency, let's talk about digital cash or tokenization of cash and convert it to a coin that maybe represents corporate cash, things like that. So these are actually real legitimate business cases of using the tokenization, digitization, cryptocurrency technology that 6 months ago scared people off just because of the whole ICO factor.
Yes, do you have any?
No.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about it, I mean, I'll answer the question in terms of why there's no adoption. But I think, what is a blockchain, right? A blockchain is essentially a database. It's a ledger that keeps track of who has what assets. And so it's, very encouraging to hear what Tom just mentioned in terms of companies actually being open to exploring digital cash and things like that. Because there's this narrative that's been driven that blockchain is good but cryptocurrencies are bad, and that's a narrative that's been driven by the mainstream media, by central banks. But in general, I think the cryptocurrency is literally like a fuel to the engine, and the engine is blockchain. But at the end of the day, we've been using databases for the last 30 years without the use of cryptocurrencies. So basically, the cryptocurrency, what does a cryptocurrency do inside a blockchain? What the cryptocurrency does is make sure that the different stakeholders that have access to a particular ledger or a particular database, their incentives are aligned. And that's why I call cryptocurrencies sort of the engine to, sort of the fuel to the engine, which is the blockchain. So I think in general, why is there no adoption, or why is there a lack of adoption of a lot of applications? being built in the crypto and blockchain ecosystem is because it's super difficult to use. I mean, if you had to use, I mean, again, you're going back to the same example. If you had to use CLI or command line interface to be able to interact with the internet, I think half the people in the room would not be using the internet. It's because it's easy to use today, that's why we use it. And I think we're reaching a point over the next couple of years where a lot of these applications that are being built in the crypto ecosystem will become simple enough to use so that everyday, regular people who don't really care about what's happening in the backend, who don't really care about what's, like when you're sending an email, you don't have to think about, what the different processes that happen in the backend for you to be able to use the technology. There was one term that was mentioned, which was a foundational technology, right? And I agree with that. Blockchain is a foundational technology. But what is a foundational technology, right? A foundational technology, in my view, is a technology where the end user does not need to understand what's happening in the background to be able to use this technology. So things like, and we have this in our investor deck as well. So fire was a foundational technology when it was initially discovered. If we didn't have fire, we wouldn't have electricity. And so that's the second property of a foundational technology. Other technologies can be built on top of this technology. If we didn't have electricity, we wouldn't have personal computers. If we didn't have personal computers, there was no need for internet if there was no personal computer. There would be no smartphones if there was no internet. So these are all foundational technologies. We don't need to know how a phone is built in order to use it, right? So again, going back to the two properties of what a foundational technology is. A foundational technology, the end user doesn't need to understand what's happening in the background. And secondly, other technologies are built on top of it. So we've got fire, we've got electricity, we've got personal computers, we've got the internet, we've got smartphone. And now because these smartphones are generating so much data, you need to store the data somewhere. And then you need to do something with the data in order to make sure that the user experience becomes better. And that's why on top of the internet, we've got multiple technologies, multiple new foundational technologies being built, which is artificial intelligence, which is blockchain, which is IoT. So again, I think it's sort of an iterative process of, and again, I think once we reach a point where artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and blockchain become foundational technologies, so much so that every company has blockchain or big data as part of their tech stack, there'll be other technologies that'll be built on top of these.
Paul, is interesting. I just realized that this is one of the, in fact, it's the first session that started with blockchain, but didn't have a blockchain 101 to kick off. The first question didn't come with, so tell me what exactly is blockchain, right? Because 2 years ago, in fact, or 2 or 3 years ago, most of the sessions, you will spend 70–80% of the time talking about what is blockchain, trying to explain the concepts behind it, and 20% of the time talking about the roadmap ahead, and it shows how much it has evolved over the past 2 or 3 years, actually.
That's a good point, actually. I mean, does anyone here not know what a blockchain is? You put your hand up, okay. So we are good then, yeah, but I quite agree, yeah. In fact, 3 years ago, there used to be a room of just 10 people sitting around talking about Bitcoin mining, but it's definitely moved on since then, yeah. I think the next point I'd like to bring up really is, now we are seeing blockchain applications in production working, banging out Microsoft money and other financial assets. One of the kind of good things about blockchain is that it's decentralized, but one of the bad things is they're very siloed. So it's like a centralized, decentralized system. So the next question is, how important is interoperability between different blockchains? Say you've got a financial system built with R3 Corda, but then someone else is using Hyperledger for their trade finance, and they want to start talking to each other. How important is that now or in the future, and what is being done and could be done, should be done about that?
Not at all important.
I think it is.
Every time we bid on a project or we answer an RFP, we get asked that question. So it's obviously on the minds of people. However, if you actually press them on it and say, what is your use case for actually doing that? They don't have one. Because the technology simply isn't isn't that mature yet.
Yeah.
So you have a couple companies out there that are trying to build some bridging between the various blockchains. Accenture, for example, claims that they have some technology that bridges between, for example, Corda, Fabric, Quorum, and they claim even transactionality across those platforms, which I find a little bit hard to believe, but I don't really know much about their technology. I know Microsoft is doing work on Azure, for example, to do bridging between the blockchains, though it's less about, say, transactionality across the blockchains and more about, say, porting a data model or smart contract from one to the other. All that being said, so for example, we at R3, we've done some internal proofs of showing, yeah, we can talk to Fabric or we can talk to Quorum, or at least withdraw data from there or insert data in there. But obviously that's a far cry from, say, transactionality between them. Another tack that we're approaching with this, very indirectly actually, is around standardization of data models. So for example, work that ISO does, or ISDA, for example, where they define metadata models for things like financial assets, so that I can describe something like a bond or a stock in such a way via XML or some other taxonomy language, such that if I can implement it on a Ethereum protocol and then also pick that up, transfer it, and implement it on a Corda protocol or a Fabric protocol. The problem with those kinds of standards bodies is they take forever. So the chances of us seeing anything like those data models anytime in our lifetime is probably not that great. But nevertheless, if we would get to that kind of standpoint, then, for example, financial applications on one platform could very easily talk to financial applications on another platform, or at least move those assets across from one to another. Final thought on all this is that from a technology perspective, one thing that we've done with Corda at R3, because we use the UTXO data model for describing our data models, you can actually have networks of Corda networks. So we can't necessarily directly talk to other protocol networks, but we can talk to other Corda networks, so that I could have digital cash network have cash flow into a trade finance or supply chain network. And those are two completely different networks.
Do you both agree with Tom that the whole world should be R3?
Would you understand?
Yeah, I think, again, how many of you hold any form of cryptocurrencies?
Wow.
Okay. So, I mean, there's different protocols that are out there. So Ethereum is the biggest, so I mean, beyond Bitcoin and Ethereum, there are a few other protocols, right? So you've got protocols like EOS, Neo, you've got Tezos, there's a few coming in the future. So we've got projects like Definity coming up. We've got so many different blockchains. And then we have, so these are all the public blockchains. And then we have private blockchains like Corda, like Hyperledger. And so the problem today, and why is interoperability even a question, or why are we even talking about it? And the reason is because all these blockchains kind of exist in silo today, right? So Hyperledger does not interact with Corda. Corda does not interact with Ethereum. Ethereum doesn't speak to the other public blockchains. So you've got all these blockchains that exist in silo, and what the problem that you're trying to solve in this case, and hence the question, is how do these blockchains kind of interact with each other? Because if I've built an application, so I'm an enterprise and I use Corda, but one of my vendors is actually using Ethereum for their needs. I need our systems to be able to speak to each other. And that's where the problem of interoperability comes in. So there's a few ways how this problem is being solved. And it's being solved both by enterprises as well as, and when I say enterprises, it basically means the private blockchain aspect, and it's also being solved by some of the public blockchain projects, so the public protocols. So on the private side, you've got something like Interledger, which helps you interact, which helps different blockchains speak to each other. On the public side, you've got projects like Cosmos. Anyone heard of Cosmos? Yeah. Cosmos is trying to solve the problem of blockchain interoperability. It's called the Internet of Blockchains, which so Cosmos went live very, very recently, and basically what they want to do is help different assets interact with each other. So if you're if you're holding Ethereum and you want to convert it into an EOS, or you're holding an EOS and you want to convert it into a NEO, you can do that through this protocol that sits on top of all of these individual siloed protocols and help in the interaction. The other project that is super exciting in the interoperability space is this thing called Polkadot. So each of these protocols have their own assets or their own digital tokens, but they're also smart contract platforms. Now the thing is, if you've built an application on a particular protocol and you're running the smart contract on this particular protocol, the thing is, if one of the companies or one of the other businesses that you need to interact with, if they're running their smart contract on a different protocol, our smart contracts cannot speak to each other today. And so Polkadot is trying to solve the problem of smart contract interoperability, where smart contracts built on different protocols will be able to speak to each other, again, through this protocol that sits at the top.
Just one thing to add as well, along the same lines as what's been discussed. In fact, when we talk about slow take-up rate of blockchain, interoperability is one of the issues as well, because there's a lot of large organizations that take a step back and say, which blockchain should I put my bet on? Which is the blockchain that will rule them all, right? And obviously the answer is, there's 3 or 4 big ones out there, and there's so many others out there, right? And there's so many new projects that's ongoing, there's R&D taking off, and so which is why people take a step back and say, maybe I should adopt a wait and see attitude and see which blockchain will rule them all. But I have a slightly different point of view as well. I feel that eventually blockchains will evolve towards a few large ecosystems. So one point to maybe start the conversation is the difference between private and a public blockchain. A lot of private blockchains, in fact, a lot of those large implementations we have seen, enterprise implementations, are private blockchains. And if you look at the way it's designed and structured, private blockchains looks very much like a central system, right? Because there's typically a key owner that dictates who comes on board and who doesn't come on board. There'll be one person holding on to the IP even. So because of that, I feel that it is not maximizing the full potential of what blockchain can do. And as a result, their ability to scale will be less. Is there no need for private blockchain? No, because there will be some cases like in the military, in healthcare, where data is extremely sensitive that you will still need private blockchains. But I feel that in the long term, the economy, the ecosystem will go towards more public type blockchains where you have very easy access. And one of the research that we have been doing is around ZKP, which is zero knowledge proof for public blockchain. So if you Google ZKP or EY, you will see that last December, November-December period, we released a research paper that we actually post a private transaction on ZKP on a public Ethereum blockchain. So that solved one big problem, right? One of the biggest problems why enterprises don't want to put their data on a public blockchain is because everybody can see what I'm doing, right? So if today you buy a Bitcoin, in fact, every single transaction's on Bitcoin because it's on a public blockchain, you can see it. But I don't want to do that for my confidential enterprise data where I'm trading with another party and how much I have sold, how much is the unit price. Those, I want it to be confidential. And I feel that ZKP is one of the missing link that allows public blockchain to be fully utilized for enterprise transactions. And that will in fact solve a lot of interoperability issue. Tom, yeah.
I just wanted to make one final point. Well, actually, first of all, I completely disagree with Jimmy. but talk to me when ZKP gets above 1 transaction per minute. But actually, Tushar had made a good point about tokenization that it reminded me of something. That is, basically, you can tokenize anything, right? Including other coins and other tokens. So that's one thing that we've been looking at, that now that we've we've added additional capability to Corda to support kind of abstract away from the underlying Corda plumbing to create tokens and coins and make it easy to define those. That's one way that I could interoperate with something like public cryptocurrencies, because I could tokenize those assets. I can literally tokenize any asset, but that includes other currencies and other cryptocurrencies. So I can do something like, for example, where I might have a wallet on Ethereum or on Bitcoin. I basically peg that wallet, represent whatever Bitcoins or Ether that I have as tokenized assets on Corda, and eventually that's going to be true of Fabric as well. And then do my transactions and settle out either onto the ledger on Corda or back out to a Bitcoin or Ethereum. We actually have a client that does exactly that. They run ERC20 tokens on Ethereum, and they basically use Corda as the ledger of record. So when we talk about, when we were talking about the interoperability of the blockchains, I was thinking more in terms of the protocol and the data models. But if we want to focus on the value of, say, a currency or a coin or a tokenized asset, that's actually not as hard to do because, again, I can tokenize those assets. And conversely, even if I have a coin on Corda, I could probably represent out in Bitcoin or Ether as well.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I do want to move on to question and answers soon, because I know there's lots of questions here, and I'm sure that on the floor as well. But just before we move on to there, one final word from each of the panelists on what's the future, maybe 5 years, 10 years, where's this going to end up?
Maybe I just kick this off. I feel blockchain adoption is a slow and steady thing. It's very unlike Bitcoin. So because people have look at cryptocurrencies and they have the perception that adoption of blockchain as a technology is like Bitcoin, right? In 2017, where you shoot all the way out. The graph is a very steep climb. So blockchain adoption, as it takes off, will be a slow and steady one, right? As you see more and more ecosystem coming live, and the ecosystem slowly become more mature, and then more and more companies join the ecosystem, you will see it taking off. And I agree as well, no, that it's not a 1-2 year journey. It's a 10-year journey in my mind, right? That this kind of adoption of blockchain will slowly take off. The second thing is, as it takes off as well, people are going to use blockchain very much like they use internet as a technology, right? You and I today use internet every day, but we have very little idea what goes on behind it. So you may be using certain systems in future that has distributed ledger or blockchain as a underpinning database, right? But you may not be aware of it because it is actually the technology that will be driving different ecosystems already. So there may be days, they'll come in 10 years' time that a lot of things is actually on a blockchain, but many of us who are users of that technology will not be aware of it.
The road to hell is paved with great ideas and technologies that didn't quite make it in the marketplace for one reason or another. Go ask Digital Equipment Corporation about that. So I'm going to take a bit of a contrarian view, even working for a blockchain company as I do, and say the jury's still out on what's going to happen with blockchain. It may emerge as being basically Internet 3.0, as for example Joe Lubin of Consensus will tell you that Ethereum eventually will be. It may be just the plumbing that people use as middleware in the same way that they use database technology and nobody thinks twice about it. Or it may be the case that killer app never quite comes along that puts it over the top. So that cryptocurrencies forever kind of remain a niche. Blockchain had its day in the sun. It's replaced some databases, but by and large, we're still running Oracle and what have you. Again, I think the jury is still out on that. Going back to the internet example, I'm dating myself to say I was on the internet back when it was the ARPANET in 1983. And the killer app all along was email. Yes. So, I mean, people were using email long before there was the web. And then you had text-based browsers and search engines and so forth, even before you had HTML. And HTML obviously took it up to another level, HTTP, HTML. But going back 40 years ago, email was the killer app. And to a large extent, it still is. I mean, we still message, we still email. I think if blockchain is really, really going to succeed, it probably needs that killer app. Now, that killer app might prove to be cryptocurrency in the end. It may prove to be enterprise blockchains, basically bringing counterparties together through consortiums and what have you, and business networks. It may eventually be IBM and Hyperledger. Yeah, I just pictured a dystopian world where World War III had already occurred and IBM rules us all. I can say that, they're my former employer. But so to that extent, I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I don't really have a strong prediction on that. I'm keeping a fairly open mind. And again, I think Jimmy kind of alluded to this. You're going to start to see intermingling of these different protocols. There will be eventually some winners. There will be a lot of losers. And where R3, for example, might be, or where Hyperledger might be, or where Ethereum might be 5 years from now, it's really difficult to say, but it'll certainly be quite interesting.
I think in general, I think just to sum up, I think we live in a time where as retail investors, we have access to something that could be kind of like a venture capital investment, but with public market liquidity. You know, so the way I view it, and the reason I work in the industry, and I know there are some you know, folks who are in university at the moment and you're trying to make career choices. In general, I believe in building optionality into your life, right? 1x downside, 10x upside. And that's from a career perspective, that's financially. So my advice would be, and this is not financial advice, but I think everyone should have some exposure to this ecosystem. So, you know, just buy Bitcoin. I mean, don't go into any of the altcoins, don't go fancy. Just buy a little bit of Bitcoin, have some exposure. You know, depending on how much you put in, there's a potential, there's a likelihood, there's a probability that it could be life-changing money for a lot of people. It's like, you know, like the way, like I come from India, my parents are, you know, my parents always sent me these articles that come in the mainstream media about how cryptocurrency is a scam, and you know, and it's a tough job explaining this to your parents. But you know, the way I convinced them was like, you know, like I wouldn't need to work today if my grandparents had bought a lot of land like 100 years ago, or you know, 60, 70 years ago as well. And so, you know, like something like Bitcoin has the potential to become, there's an off chance that it might become something like that. And the beautiful thing is that anyone, and you can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin, that anyone has the capability to invest in it. You know, it could very well, you know, do a 10x, 20x, 30x, 100x return. And so that's the beautiful thing. I mean, you know, you have venture capital returns, but with the public market liquidity.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so we'll move to questions. So if anyone in the floor wants to stand up and ask a question, I think there's microphones going around. While you're thinking about that, we'll go to probably the most serious question here, actually. It's quite a serious topic. The question is, Paul and Tom, did you shop at the same clothes store? And Ashkar's quite close. He got the right pattern, but unfortunately,
I told him that I got the memo saying wear plaid tonight.
Unfortunately, Jimmy didn't get the memo. So
I must have missed it. I mean, somehow.
It's the odd one out. Yeah. Okay, I'd like to take a question.
Question for both Jimmy and Tom. We're talking about enterprise adoption, so lots of talk about doing the research, proof of concepts and all that. Have you actually had a project that is in the stage of really building it or already in use yet? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it's actually doing.
Sure. So the example I gave just now on Microsoft is a live example. It's already in production, and there are besides Microsoft, 7 other partners of them that's already using it. Another example I can give, which one of my favorite ones is a wine blockchain. And that's developed in Italy. It started in Italy. It's probably made its way around now because it's being deployed, as I speak, in China as well. So the wine blockchain allows traceability of every bottle of wine all the way from vineyard to the retailer. So what it does is integrates, we spoke about blockchain being good integrators of ecosystem. So this one integrates the wine manufacturing ecosystem. You have very small producers of vineyards where they are sole proprietors, they own their grapes. They sell the grapes to wine pressers or the wine manufacturers who ferment them, and then different parties may bottle them, and then it goes to big distributors that ship it overseas. So many parties, all having their own different operating system and how they track the production of wine. So the blockchain in this case is on a public blockchain, and is the underpinning platform to integrate this and track every bottle to its source. The main objective obviously is to one way to reduce fraud, reduce counterfeit wines. I always say that it doesn't prevent totally, right? It doesn't prevent you and I from taking a bottle, replacing it with Ribena and giving it to a friend to say that this is a bottle of Italian wine, right? But it does make it very difficult. It does make it difficult because if I go to a shop and that bottle, I scan it, doesn't have the full information, or if it's a replicated QR code, you will realize that it's not actually from the correct originator. So it will reduce a certain amount, it won't prevent it totally. I think that's the benefit of that blockchain. It has gone to many other food traceability. I heard that it's starting on mozzarella cheese now. We are doing another project with Carrefour as well to trace some of their products. So quite a number on traceability as a topic.
And I'm surprised you didn't mention the one that we did with EY, and that was InsureWave. So that was maritime insurance. EY did the work. Maersk was the one who sponsored it. Runs on Microsoft Azure. So it's all about basically maritime insurance. Insurance is actually a very big area for us. We have two different insurance consortiums that are building a reinsurance application. Another one is kind of property and casualty and life. Digitization of tokenization and digitization of assets actually is a fairly hot topic right now. Working on Bank of Thailand is doing a pilot on central bank digital cash with the major banks in Thailand. We have a major Asian corporation that is kind of piloting, kicking the tires on corporate digitization of cash. So again, it's that creating corporate coin that represents their cash position. Never ICOs, never sees the light of day, but it's for liquidity, transparency purposes, going cross-border, things like that. Exiting out the different payment rails. Speaking of which, we announced with Swift that they're plugging their network into an application we wrote for doing payment and obligation settlement. Similarly, our first version of that we did with XRP of all things. So the Ripple crowd went crazy and said, oh, R3 and Ripple are in bed together. It's like, no, not quite. We're still in the bathroom and they're still in the living room. But and literally, all sorts of different kind of payments, high value commodities, gold, tokenization of gold, carbon credits. These are all real pilots or POCs that are underway.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next question here, which is getting some top votes. It says, how big a threat is quantum computers to blockchain now in the next 10 years? This is quite a common question, has been around for some time. Quantum computers is sort of a different way of doing computing, where instead of you have bits like 0 and 1, you have quantum bits, which are a superposition of 0 and 1, so they're not really 1, they're not really 0, they're a probability in between. And one of the main things that can do for certain mathematical algorithms, it makes it a lot more efficient. So at the moment, encryption, it would take you more than the age of the universe to break your average encryption. With a quantum computer, that could come down to a matter of minutes or hours. And as blockchain is based on cryptography, it's a concern. Personally, I also like to think about quantum computers being enabling blockchains to do more stuff, but I hear what the panel thinks about that one.
So it's something that R3 pays attention to. We know it's on the horizon, and we have to address it in some way. Obviously, zero-knowledge proofs might be one way to address that, but the performance isn't there yet. It's not going to be there for quite a while. Another way that we're looking at addressing it is through hardware enclaves, so that, for example, there are certain technologies out there, not the least of which is Intel SGX, where you do operations in a secure part of, actually in their case, the microchip, where it's assumed that that enclave does not trust the rest of the computer whatsoever. has its own key embedded in there. So whatever operations it does in that enclave do not get outside of that secure enclave. And that is partially with an eye towards quantum computing. I know IBM has some similar technology on the mainframe, for example, to do that. And I was chatting with an IBM guy a couple weeks ago, and he said, we've actually tested it against our own quantum computers to make sure we're unhackable in that regard. So stay tuned to this page. Some weirder stuff has happened than R3 working with IBM.
Any other comments on that one?
I think you might be.
That's right, yeah, a question, yeah. I mean, actually, just a bit more. I mean, quantum computers are actually making leaps and bounds. I mean, it used to be just theoretical a few years ago. Last year, there was the first quantum computer done on standard, but made by standard silicon manufacturing. It's still on super clean silicon, but I think that's a huge step forward. We're now up to like 70 or 80 qubits. With the IBM machines and the Google, Alibaba, they're all bringing out quantum computers as well. So I think this year and next year, we're going to see even more. To make a quantum computer do something useful, you've still got to get up to like 100 or even 200 qubits. So we aren't quite there yet. But the speed and pace of quantum computing is coming along quite quickly. So it may not be 10 years. And if it gets out of the super cold, now they all run at sort of a few degrees Kelvin or even millikelvin, which is minus 273 degrees. If they become room temperature, then you may have a quantum computer on your phone. Then the game changes quite significantly, but that's probably a few years out yet.
Maybe I just add one point that Tom mentioned. Tom mentioned that ZKP may be one of the solutions out there as well. And interestingly, when we first deployed the first ZKP transaction last year, it was obviously very expensive. Yeah, it was a large amount of, just for that single transaction, it's not practical. Since then, it has improved, just pure code optimization, it has improved about 90% of the transaction cost involved, and cross our fingers, by the end of the year, we are hoping that on top of this 90%, there will be another 90% improvement in the cost, which brings it to be about $1 for every transaction, which makes it practical and very usable for enterprise-wide transactions as well. So, but that's in 6 months or 12 months time to come, so stay tuned to that as well.
Is there any more questions from the floor? Yeah, okay. We've got a couple.
I think my voice is loud enough. So far,
yeah, go ahead.
So this is addressed not to anyone in particular, but probably to all, if you can answer these questions. But so far, the questions has always been has all centered on enterprise-driven blockchain. But the internet world that we know, which is probably more familiar to all of us here, has been driven by retail, the you and me's, doing frivolous stuff, searching for movies, love, games, gambling, Toto, whatever it was. And enterprises were very slow to pick up. They actually kind of resisted that at the beginning because they have their legacy SAPs and ERPs. My feeling might be, I'm nowhere 1% accomplished as you guys, is that in order for this to be fundamental technology, it has to be an everyday person's usage. Right, so today, if I go to one of the altcoins or one of the exchanges, I have to have one account for each exchange. The interoperability between something like crypto, which is the most tokenized, is a pain. Not to talk about other blockchains. So would you want to comment how the real take-up will occur on the retail space?
Yeah, I mean, those are the startups that we're trying to fund. I absolutely agree with your viewpoint. I mean, it's in general because of enterprises in general are relatively slower to move because they have internal friction, they have bureaucracy, red tapeism, and that's the reason why startups have done so well over the last 2-3 decades, and why some of the startups have gone on to actually become those enterprises that have become relatively slower. And so, I mean, that's our view as well. So the view that we take is So the way we've constructed our portfolio, or the way we're looking at constructing our portfolio, so we have about 50% allocation to equity stakes in early stage blockchain startups, and 50% allocation to cryptocurrencies and tokens that we fundamentally believe in over a relatively longer term horizon. And longer term in crypto is a little bit different to longer term outside of crypto. But so that's kind of our viewpoint. In general, what we're trying to do is, especially on the equity side, we fund a lot of startups. Like while we were setting up the fund, we ran into a lot of issues. So the MAS was like, how are you going to securely custodize these assets? So in the traditional world, you have custodial solution providers, you have custodians, but as a fund manager, like where do you store your crypto, right? And so there are things that we had to do to put processes in place to make sure that we store our cryptocurrency safely. But one of the first companies that we backed is actually a custodial solution. In general, people complain about the high amount of volatility. So you don't want to hold on to a particular crypto asset because it's super volatile. And so, there are, one of the other companies that we backed is a cryptocurrency options exchange. So you can actually hedge your risks. Some of the other, we wanted to, when we reach out to LPs, when we reach out to investors into our fund, there were some investors who wanted to subscribe into our fund, who wanted to invest into our fund using cryptocurrencies and not using USD. And then we ran into friction with our lawyers because our lawyers were like, basically from a KYC AML perspective, how do you prove that this Bitcoin is clean, that it hasn't been part of a scam or a hack before, right? So one of the companies that we're looking at funding right now is a know your transaction or a transaction monitoring tool, where it basically crawls through different blockchains and tries to identify wallets that have previously been associated with scams, with wash trading, with Ponzi schemes. So it's basically, we're trying to, what we call the picks and the shovels of the crypto industry, or the ecosystem enablers, things that help companies that are already in the crypto ecosystem, or help to bring more people into crypto. Those are the companies that we're trying to back. Right? So small things like, if you're a crypto company today and part of your balance sheet is in USD and part of your balance sheet is in crypto because you pay some of your employees in crypto, or you pay some of your vendors or service providers in crypto, there's no accounting solution for it. So we're actively on the lookout for a good accounting solution that solves the problem of taking care of accounting needs for crypto native corporations, and something that could plug into something like an SAP, or Xero, or the regular SaaS accounting solutions. So I mean, there's so many different, if you want to buy cryptocurrency today using Singapore dollars, it can be a hassle. You have to create an account, you need to have a password, you need to set up two-factor authentication to make sure that you don't lose your assets. So the on-ramp from fiat currency into cryptocurrency is one of the bottlenecks as well, which prevents a lot of people from coming into cryptocurrency. And so you want to, one of the companies we were exploring but didn't go ahead with is they were trying to sell little scratch cards at 7-Elevens, which would help you purchase your first cryptocurrencies using cash. But those are ways in which how one could get on-ramped into the cryptocurrency ecosystem. And so those are the companies that we want to back as well.
Okay. Yeah, one little thing to add. One of the biggest retail usage of blockchain is in fact the buying of heroin. So, as we know, one of the big usage of Bitcoin is people use it to buy illegal stuff, right? Heroines, drugs, and so on. And I sidetrack a bit, but I feel that it doesn't really make sense, right? Because Bitcoin is on a public blockchain. And you can track every single transactions out there on the Bitcoin since day one. So if you're buying heroin on a blockchain, not only is it traceable, eventually you got to cash it out, right? So you will eventually need to convert the Bitcoin to usable dollars, and you will get caught. And not only you will get caught, but that transaction is on an immutable ledger, and you will be there forever, right? So it doesn't really make sense to buy or do illegal activities on Bitcoin, if you ask me, right? My opinion on that is that, in fact, on blockchain, and in fact for any technology solutions, you don't try to solve a problem where there's already an existing solution, right? So even if the existing solution is not perfect, right, but it's doing well, there's no need to try to rip it out, the plumbing, and try to implement something new, and especially something as complex as blockchain. So if you ask me, a lot of consumer type transactions, apps, payments, and things like that, there's already existing solution, and they may not be perfect, but they are doing well. And blockchain as a batch transaction, processing transactions will never be as fast as a centralized systems. Right, so if you weigh the pros and cons, if you were to invest a large amount of money to solve a problem that's already having an existing solution, you're not going to make that happen. But if you look at large enterprise ecosystems, they have a lot of shortcomings. They have a lot of shortcomings because today ERPs are designed for the enterprise and not for cross-enterprise. And as a result, you will see a lot more use cases coming out, and those use cases are the ones that will reap a lot of savings and reap a lot of efficiencies between cross-enterprise kind of transaction, which is why I guess a lot of our focus is on enterprise-type use cases.
Okay, thanks. There's a very interesting question here, which I think is part of the whole potential future of blockchain, which is, are central banks looking to deploy their own cryptocurrency? What's the purpose? I know MAS has their Project Ubin, which has that in mind as well. So what's the future of national cryptocurrencies?
So to my knowledge, no country, no central bank is looking at deploying a cryptocurrency. That's a lot different, though, from digital cash, which is just a digital representation of whatever the native currency is. So in that case, there are companies, or I should say central banks, actually doing at least pilots on the concept of digital cash. So Project Ubin was done here by Monetary Authority of Singapore. One of the later versions of Ubin, they actually talked to the Central Bank of Canada in order to do cross-border settlement and payment. As I mentioned, the Bank of Thailand right now is doing a digital cash pilot amongst a lot of the corporate banks in Thailand. And we've, at least from an R3 perspective, we've been talking to a number of different central banks about the possibility of digital cash. Some are very interested, some not so much, but to my knowledge, I have not yet heard of any central bank interested in creating a currency other than the native currency.
Apart from Venezuela. So Venezuela created Petra.
Oh, right.
Yeah. But that's a different topic altogether. But that kind of goes on to show the use case of cryptocurrency as well, right? So Venezuela has hyperinflation, and the country's not doing so well, and the central bank decided to come up with a solution which is not the most optimal, but again, they did explore it. I think in the future, I think if we were to extrapolate and kind of try to predict the future, I think that all of these cryptocurrencies will kind of coexist with sovereign cryptocurrencies. So I think the future is going to be, we're not going to have, I think it's already happening with digital cash, as Tom said. But I think in the future, each country will, it's a possibility that every country would have its own kind of native cryptocurrency, and the central banks would be implementing the stability of this cryptocurrency through their monetary policies. But I think it'll coexist with some of the other cryptocurrencies which are not linked to any nation, which are non-sovereign.
When Christine Lagarde was in Singapore last year, in fact, she spoke about central bank issued digital currency. She was encouraging central banks to explore digital currencies. And I feel that different jurisdictions will do it in a slightly different way. In a country like Singapore, where the monetary policy behind Singapore dollar is a basket of currencies, and there's a lot of controls about how this currency flows, maybe it doesn't make so much sense to use it for a retail perspective, right? But it does make sense to use it in a cross-border perspective, like those examples that Tom has mentioned that Project Ubin is trying to try out. So that might be one way it goes, right, where central bank issued digital currencies are used for cross-border exchanges. But there are other countries as well that might explore it in a different way, right? But when you have a lot of unbanked groups, whether can this central bank issued digital currencies be propagated down to the very last guy, propagated down to where the need is to be realized as well. So that might be one other way of exploring central bank issued digital currency as well. But I certainly feel that most of these currencies will be fiat currency that's tokenized, right? So it is your native currencies, US dollar on the blockchain or Singapore dollar on blockchain and so on, right? Because at the end of the day, each country will still need its own fiat currency to function. You and I still pay our taxes in Singapore dollar or in US dollar, and the trade still go on in the fiat currency. So if there's a digital currency to be issued, it's likely to be the fiat currency that the country is using.
I think, sorry, just to jump in, I think in general, you know, the target market of cryptocurrency is more the developing nations than developed nations. I mean, in Singapore, you don't really need cryptocurrencies, right? Like, you go to any shop, you can pay, you know, using PayWave, you can pay using, there's 20 different ways to pay without using cash. But I think the real use case comes in developing nations where the central bank itself has failed to perform its duties of maintaining inflation at a steady rate. And I think that's where it becomes super interesting, where you know, in something like a Venezuela or a Zimbabwe, people are very comfortable, you know, holding onto Bitcoin even though it's highly volatile, because it's still less volatile than their native currency.
Okay, thanks. I think we've got time for one more question. I think there was one on the floor. Yeah.
I am interested in decentralized finance. For further development of decentralized finance, I think credit scoring is key. For example, for consumer finance or mass finance, credit scoring is necessary. So how can we implement or avoid the problem of credit scoring in the finance?
So is your question like, should there be credit scoring or there shouldn't be credit scoring?
I'm not sure whether credit scoring is perfectly necessary in the decentralized finance. However, do you have any opinion on the topic of credit scoring in the decentralized finance?
Yeah, so I think in the decentralized finance world, if you, so where does credit scoring come into the picture? When you want to take a loan, right? And what happens in today's context is you want to buy a house, you put the house up as collateral, you put a little bit of a down payment. In the crypto space, if there's no central party kind of checking whether you're actually worthy of repaying your loan, you know, how do you actually give out a loan to someone? So what happens today in the cryptocurrency world is that there is over-collateralization, which actually doesn't make sense, because if I want to borrow $100, today I actually need to lock up $150 to be able to, so there's a 1.5x collateralization. And again, you know, in case the collateral, because the collateral in this case could be Ethereum, and if the value of Ethereum is dropping, then I might need to top up in case the collateral drops. So that's how it works today, where there's over-collateralization. I think there's a couple of ways to go about it. There are reputation systems being formed where over a period of time, and it's kind of like how Uber works as well, right? Or how Airbnb works, where you leave a review, where you leave a rating, and over a period of time, depending on the multiple transactions that you've done, you kind of automatically form a credit scoring, which is sort of crowdsourced over the multiple transactions that you've done. So, you know, if I've taken 80 or 100 loans over the course of the next 10 years, and I've managed to repay all of my loans on a very good term. There could be an app where if you want to take a loan, instead of going to the bank and trying to show your creditworthiness or your business plan, you just basically tap into the history of all the loans that you've taken, which is publicly available. And then you tap into that reputation management system. Or the other alternative is that you over-collateralize, but then there are other issues because it beats the purpose. If you have to over-collateralize, then what's the point of taking a loan?
Okay, thanks. So I think we're out of time. So I'd just like to thank the panelists again, and thank you all for your questions. There's still lots of good questions, which unfortunately we can't get to, but maybe we'll be available afterwards for a short time. And I'll hand back to Evan SMUB.
Hi, can we give them another round of applause for the time and them sharing the knowledge, especially in this space. And with that, before we end the session, I'd like to ask a favor before you leave. We're going to take 2 photos. Firstly, one with my team and the panelists, and one more where all of you will look behind later, where the photographer will go up, just for memory's sake. Yep, thanks for your time. And without further ado, I'd like to present this, and you join me in giving them a round of applause once again. Okay, can SMB, the members, exco members will come up and we get a photo with them.
Should we stand as well?
Okay, actually, should we just get the group photo first before you all leave? The photographer is up there. All of us just stand up and look behind, on top. Okay, just on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Just make it around.
Can we get one more photo?
Sure. Jimmy.
Hi.
Do you have this program in all offices?
Some of them are on the
in one big group or just concentrated?
Hi, Melissa. Nice to meet you. You truly coordinated. 3 out of 4 plaid shirts, not bad. It was a prerequisite, is it? Be on the panel, wear a plaid shirt. Oh, okay, even better. You communicate.